The dirt under Clara Nash's boots crumbled as she drove the shovel deeper into the desert earth, her hands raw and bleeding, while three men with loaded rifles watched her dig what they intended to be her grave. The sun had crossed its peak hours ago, and now the sky burned orange and red across the New Mexico horizon, casting long shadows over the barren landscape outside Pinos Altos. She had been digging for nearly 3 hours, and the hole was deep enough now that when she stood in it, only her shoulders and head remained visible above ground level. "That's deep enough," said the man with the scar running down his left cheek, the one they called Dutch. He spat tobacco juice into the dirt near the hole's edge. "Climb on out of there, girl. Time to say your prayers." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had survived 22 years in this harsh territory, orphaned at 16 when cholera took her parents, and she refused to let these outlaws see her fear. Her dark hair clung to her sweat-soaked neck, and her blue cotton dress was stained brown with dirt and dust. She planted the shovel blade into the ground and looked up at her captors with defiant eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The second man, thin as a rail with hollow cheeks and yellowed teeth, laughed. "You saw what you should not have seen, Miss Nash. Dutch and Pike here do not take kindly to witnesses." The third man, Pike, was the largest of the three, with broad shoulders and hands the size of dinner plates. He checked his revolver with casual indifference, spinning the cylinder before snapping it back into place. "Should have minded your own business when you saw us coming out of that bank." Clara's mind raced back to that morning. She had been walking to the general store in Pinos Altos when she witnessed these three men rushing out of the territorial bank with sacks of money, their bandanas pulled down in their haste. She had frozen on the boardwalk, and Dutch had locked eyes with her for just a moment before they mounted their horses and rode out of town. She thought they had escaped, thought she was safe. But they had doubled back and grabbed her from behind the livery stable that afternoon, dragging her onto a horse and riding 6 miles out into the desert. "I would not have told anyone," Clara said, though she knew it was a lie. She would have reported them to Sheriff Morrison the moment she had the chance. "Too late for that now," Dutch said, raising his rifle. "You two, help her out of that hole. Might as well let her die on solid ground." The thin man and Pike approached the grave's edge, reaching down to grab Clara's arms. She felt their fingers close around her wrists, and just as they began to haul her upward, a voice cut through the desert air like a whip crack. "Let her go." All 4 of them froze. Clara twisted her head to see a lone rider approaching from the east, silhouetted against the setting sun. He sat tall in the saddle atop a paint horse, and even from a distance, she could see the rifle resting across his lap. As he drew closer, details emerged. A brown Stetson pulled low over his eyes, a weathered leather vest over a dark shirt, and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. Dutch released Clara's wrist and spun toward the newcomer, raising his rifle. "This is not your concern, stranger. Ride on if you value your life." The rider did not slow. He guided his horse forward with practiced ease, his eyes never leaving the 3 outlaws. When he was 30 feet away, he finally stopped and dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. His rifle remained in his hand, held with the comfortable familiarity of a man who had used such weapons many times before. "I am making it my concern," the stranger said. His voice was deep and calm, carrying an authority that made even Dutch hesitate. "You have got a woman standing in a grave. That tells me all I need to know about what is happening here." Pike moved his hand toward his holstered pistol, but the stranger's rifle snapped up, the barrel pointing directly at Pike's chest. "I would not do that if I were you," the stranger said. "I can put 3 bullets in 3 men before any of you clear leather. I have done it before." There was something in his tone that suggested this was not an idle boast. The 3 outlaws exchanged glances, calculating their odds. Clara remained motionless in the grave, her heart now pounding for an entirely different reason. This stranger had appeared out of nowhere, like an answer to a prayer she had not even had time to voice. "Who are you?" Dutch demanded, though his rifle had lowered slightly. "Name is Preston Xavier," the stranger replied. "I track outlaws for the Territorial Marshal's office. Been following your trail from Socorro after that bank job you pulled there 2 weeks ago. Tracked you through 3 towns and finally caught up in Pinos Altos. Saw you ride out with the lady, and I figured you were not taking her on a pleasant afternoon ride." Clara's breath caught. This man had been following them, had come specifically to stop these outlaws. She found her voice calling up from the grave. "They robbed the bank in Pinos Altos this morning. They are going to kill me because I saw them." Preston Xavier's jaw tightened, though his eyes never left the three men. "That so? Well, that makes 4 bank robberies, kidnapping, and attempted murder. You boys are racking up quite a list of charges." The thin man's nerve broke first. He went for his gun with a jerky, panicked motion. Preston's rifle barked once, and the man spun backward, his pistol flying from his hand as he clutched his shoulder and fell to the ground, screaming. The shot echoed across the desert, sending a jackrabbit bolting from behind a nearby sagebrush. "Anyone else want to try?" Preston asked, already having worked the rifle's lever action and chambered another round. Dutch and Pike stood frozen, their hands now carefully held away from their weapons. The thin man writhed on the ground, blood seeping between his fingers as he pressed them against his wounded shoulder. "Drop your gun belts," Preston ordered. "Slow and easy. Use your left hands." Dutch and Pike complied, their fingers fumbling with the buckles before letting the belts fall to the dirt with heavy thuds. Preston gestured with his rifle barrel. "Rifles, too. Toss them aside." The 2 men threw their rifles several feet away, and Preston finally allowed himself to glance down at Clara. His eyes were a striking shade of green, she noticed, and despite the hardness in his expression, there was something gentle in the way he looked at her. "Can you climb out on your own, miss?" he asked. Clara nodded, placing her hands on the edge of the grave and pushing herself upward. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, but she managed to get one knee up onto solid ground. Preston moved quickly, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and reaching down to help her. His hands were strong and sure as they gripped her arms, pulling her up and out of the hole with ease. When her feet touched level ground, her legs nearly gave out, and Preston steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Easy now," he said softly. "You are safe." Clara looked up at him, and for the first moment since her abduction, she felt the terror begin to recede. This close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the sun-weathered skin of a man who spent his life outdoors, and the small scar above his right eyebrow. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, with the bearing of someone who had seen enough of life's hardships to take them in stride. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Preston gave her a brief nod, then turned his attention back to the outlaws. "Pike, get some rope from my saddlebag and tie up Dutch, and do not even think about trying anything stupid, because I will drop you before you take 2 steps. Pike did as instructed, moving slowly toward Preston's paint horse. The animal stood calmly, ground-tied and well-trained. Pike retrieved a coil of rope and returned, binding Dutch's hands behind his back with shaking fingers. Once Dutch was secured, Preston had Dutch tie up Pike, checking the knots himself before binding the wounded thin man. "What is your name?" Clara asked as Preston worked. "Preston Xavier, miss," he replied without looking up. "You already heard that part." "Clara Nash," she said. "I live in Pinos Altos. I have a small house near the church." "Good to know you, Miss Nash," Preston said, finishing with the ropes. He straightened and looked at her properly now. "Did they hurt you? Besides making you dig that grave, I mean." Clara shook her head. "They grabbed me rough, but no, they did not hurt me beyond that." She paused, then added, "They would have killed me, though, if you had not come when you did." Preston's expression darkened. "I know. That is why I pushed hard to catch up. When I saw them take you from town, I knew I could not let them get too far." He moved to check on the thin man's shoulder wound, examining it with professional detachment. "You will live, Evans," he said, apparently knowing the man's name from his tracking work. "Bullet went clean through. You will hang for your crimes, but you will not die from this wound today." Evans groaned but said nothing. Dutch glared at Preston with pure hatred in his eyes, while Pike simply looked defeated, staring at the ground. Preston gathered the outlaw's weapons and secured them on his horse, then helped Clara brush some of the dirt from her dress. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the desert in shades of purple and gold. The temperature would drop quickly once darkness fell. "We need to get back to town," Preston said. "It is a 6-mile ride, and I only have 1 horse. Can you ride?" "I can ride," Clara confirmed, though she was not sure how steady she would be after the ordeal she had just endured. Preston studied the 3 outlaws, then made a decision. "Pike, you're going to walk. Dutch, You're going to walk. Evans, you're going to walk too, unless you want to bleed out here in the desert. Move." 6 miles? Pike protested, with our hands tied. "Should have thought of that before you decided to kill an innocent woman," Preston said coldly. "Start walking. Head northwest back toward Pinos Altos. If any of you try to run, I will shoot you in the leg and make you walk anyway. Understood?" The 3 men started walking, stumbling occasionally but moving at a steady pace. Preston helped Clara mount his horse, then swung up behind her, taking the reins. His presence behind her was solid and reassuring, and Clara found herself relaxing slightly despite everything that had happened. They rode slowly, keeping pace with the walking outlaws. Preston kept his rifle across his lap, ready to use it at a moment's notice. The desert grew cooler as the sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "How did you know they had taken me out here?" Clara asked quietly, aware of Preston's chest against her back, his arms on either side of her as he controlled the reins. "I watched them grab you from a distance," Preston explained. "I was staking out the bank after I got word they might hit it. When I saw them ride out with you, I followed at a distance. Took me a while to close the gap because I did not want to spook them into doing something rash." "You risked your life for me," Clara said. "You did not even know me." "That is the job," Preston replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested it was more than just duty. "Could not stand by and let them murder an innocent woman." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds being the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the labored breathing of the walking outlaws ahead of them. Clara became increasingly aware of Preston's warmth behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the strength in his arms. She had never been this close to a man before, not like this, and despite the circumstances, she found herself feeling things she had never experienced. "What will happen to them?" she asked, partly to distract herself from these new sensations. "They will stand trial in Santa Fe," Preston said. "With your testimony about the Pinos Altos robbery, plus the evidence I have gathered on their other crimes, they will hang. Justice may be slow out here, but it does catch up eventually." "I will testify," Clara said firmly. "They need to pay for what they have done." "You are brave," Preston observed. "Most people would be too frightened." "I am frightened," Clara admitted, "but I am also angry. They took me from my home, made me think I was going to die. They do not get to do that without consequences." Preston made a sound of approval in his chest, and Clara felt it rumble against her back. Good. The territory needs more people with that kind of backbone. The miles passed slowly. Evans complained constantly about his shoulder, and Dutch cursed steadily under his breath, but they kept moving. Pike remained silent, his head down, perhaps contemplating the fate that awaited him. When they finally saw the lights of Pinos Altos in the distance, Clara felt relief wash over her. The small town of perhaps 200 souls had never looked so welcoming. Lanterns glowed in windows, and she could see the church steeple silhouetted against the night sky. Preston guided them straight to the sheriff's office, a small adobe building near the center of town. Sheriff Morrison came out at the sound of their approach, his hand on his pistol, until he recognized Clara. "Miss Nash!" the sheriff exclaimed, rushing forward. "We have been looking for you since this afternoon. Mrs. Henderson saw you get taken, but by the time she told me, you were long gone." "These 3 men kidnapped her and were about to kill her," Preston said, dismounting smoothly and then helping Clara down. His hands lingered on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "I am Preston Xavier, working for the territorial marshal. These men are wanted for multiple bank robberies across the territory." Sheriff Morrison was a portly man in his 50s with a magnificent white mustache and kind eyes. He immediately began herding the outlaws into his jail, calling for his deputy to help. Preston provided a brief account of what had happened while Clara stood nearby, suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion settling over her. When Preston finished his report, he turned to find Clara swaying on her feet. He moved quickly, catching her arm. "When did you last eat or drink water?" he asked with concern. Clara tried to remember. "Breakfast," she said, "before they took me." Preston's expression turned stern, though his concern was directed at her well-being rather than at her. "Sheriff, is there somewhere Miss Nash can sit and get some food and water?" "My house," Clara said weakly. "It is just 2 streets over." "I will take you," Preston said, his tone brooking no argument. He looked at Sheriff Morrison. I will return shortly to complete the paperwork and ensure those three are properly secured. The sheriff nodded. Take your time. Deputy Hayes and I can handle them. Preston kept his hand on Clara's elbow as they walked through the quiet streets of Pinos Altos. Most residents had already retired for the evening, though a few curious faces peered out from behind curtains, word having spread about Clara's abduction and rescue. She directed him to a small but tidy house with a wooden porch and a well-maintained garden visible even in the darkness. Clara fumbled with the key, her hands shaking, and Preston gently took it from her, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The interior was simple but clean, with handmade curtains, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. Preston lit a lamp, filling the space with warm light. Sit, he instructed, pulling out a chair. Clara sat gratefully while Preston found a cup and the water pitcher. He poured water and handed it to her, watching as she drank deeply. Slow down or you will make yourself sick, he cautioned. Clara forced herself to sip more slowly. Preston moved about her small kitchen with surprising competence, finding bread and cheese and cutting portions of each. He set them in front of her, then refilled her water cup. Eat, he said. Even if you do not feel hungry, your body needs it. Clara took a bite of bread, and suddenly her hunger roared to life. She ate quickly, and Preston did not rush her, simply standing nearby with his arms crossed, watching over her with those intense green eyes. When she finally finished, Clara felt more human. The terror of the past hours began to recede, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. She looked up at Preston, really looked at him in the lamplight, and felt her breath catch. He was handsome, in a rough-hewn way, with strong features and an air of quiet capability that made her feel safer than she had felt in years. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved my life today. I do not know how I can ever repay you. Preston pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her, removing his hat and setting it on the table. His dark hair was slightly matted from the hat, and he ran a hand through it absently. You do not owe me anything, Miss Nash. I was doing my job. It was more than a job, Clara insisted. You put yourself in danger for me. Those 3 men could have killed you. But they did not, Preston said with a slight smile. And you are safe. That's what matters. They sat in silence for a moment, and Clara found herself not wanting him to leave. The house suddenly felt very empty at the thought of being alone. Will you stay in Pinos Altos for a while? She asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. I will need to stay at least a few days, Preston replied. I have to complete my reports, ensure the prisoners are transported to Santa Fe properly, and take your official statement for the trial. Relief flooded through Clara. Where are you staying? The boarding house, I suppose, Preston said, if they have a room. Mrs. Chen runs the boarding house, Clara said. She will have a room. Tell her I sent you and she will give you a fair rate. Preston stood, picking up his hat. I should let you rest. You have been through a terrible ordeal, and you need sleep. Clara stood as well, not ready for him to go, but knowing he was right. She walked him to the door, and when he turned to say goodnight, they were standing very close in the small space. Clara could smell leather and sage, and something distinctly masculine that made her pulse quicken. Good night, Miss Nash, Preston said softly, his eyes searching her face. Clara, she said, please call me Clara. Clara, he repeated, and the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. Get some rest. I will come by tomorrow to check on you and take your statement if that is acceptable. That would be very acceptable, Clara said, surprising herself with her boldness. Preston smiled, a real smile this time that reached his eyes and transformed his face. Then I will see you tomorrow. He stepped out into the night, and Clara watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. She closed and locked the door, leaning against it for a moment, her heart racing. Despite the horror of what had happened, she could not stop thinking about Preston Xavier and the way his hands had felt when he pulled her from that grave. That night, Clara slept fitfully, her dreams a confused mix of terror and unexpected warmth. She woke several times, each time taking a moment to remember she was safe in her own bed. When morning light finally filtered through her curtains, she rose and found her hands still bore the marks of the shovel, blisters and raw patches that would serve as reminders of how close she had come to death. She washed and changed into a fresh dress, a simple green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She braided her dark hair and tried to calm her nerves, knowing Preston would be coming by. Part of her told herself she was being foolish, that he was simply doing his job and she should not read anything more into his actions. But another part, a part that had been lonely for so long, whispered that maybe, just maybe, there had been something more in the way he looked at her. The knock on her door came mid-morning. Clara smoothed her dress and opened it to find Preston standing on her porch, hat in hand. He had cleaned up since the night before, his face freshly shaved, his clothes brushed free of trail dust. He looked even more handsome in the daylight, and Clara felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Good morning," he said. "I hope I am not calling too early." "Not at all," Clara replied, stepping back to let him in. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a pot." "That would be wonderful," Preston said, entering her home with the same quiet confidence he seemed to bring to everything. He sat at her small table while she poured 2 cups of coffee, and Clara was grateful for something to do with her hands. They spent the next hour going over the events of the previous day, with Preston taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal. He asked detailed questions about what she had witnessed at the bank, the route the outlaws had taken out of town, and everything that had been said while they forced her to dig. Clara answered as completely as she could, though reliving the experience brought back the fear she had felt. Preston noticed her distress and reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "We can take a break if you need to," he said gently. The touch sent electricity through Clara's arm. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to finish this. I want to make sure they pay for what they did." When they finally completed the statement, Preston closed his journal and looked at her with something like admiration in his eyes. "You have a remarkable memory for details. Your testimony is going to be crucial in making sure they face justice." "When will the trial be?" Clara asked. "Probably not for a few months," Preston admitted. "The territorial judge has to make his circuit, and these things take time. But I will make sure you are notified when the date is set." Clara felt a pang of disappointment. "So you will be leaving soon, once you transport them to Santa Fe?" Preston hesitated, and Clara saw something flicker across his face. "I will need to take them to Santa Fe in a few days, yes, but my work for the marshal's office is flexible. I go where I am needed, track the criminals I'm assigned to track. There's no reason I could not return to Pinos Altos after I deliver the prisoners." Hope bloomed in Clara's chest. "Would you? Return, I mean." Preston set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. "Clara, I'm going to be honest with you. I've been doing this work for 5 years now, since I was 23 years old. I have tracked outlaws through every territory in the Southwest. I have seen terrible things and dealt with dangerous men. In all that time, I have never met anyone like you." Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "You faced death yesterday with courage and dignity," Preston said. "You stood in that grave and did not beg or plead. You looked those men in the eye and maintained your composure. And today, you are sitting here, helping me build the case against them instead of hiding away in fear. That takes a special kind of strength." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "Being brave does not mean not being afraid," Preston said. "It means doing what needs to be done despite the fear." He paused, then added more quietly, "I would very much like to return to Pinos Altos after I complete my business in Santa Fe. If you would be amenable to that." Clara felt warmth spreading through her entire body. "I would be very amenable to that." Preston smiled, and Clara found herself smiling back, and for a moment the small house felt filled with possibility and promise. Over the next 2 days, Preston was busy with his official duties, arranging for the transport of the 3 outlaws and coordinating with Sheriff Morrison. But he found time to call on Clara each day, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more. They talked about their lives, their histories, their hopes for the future. Clara learned that Preston had grown up in Texas, the son of a rancher who had lost everything in a drought when Preston was 18. He had drifted for a few years, working various jobs before finding his calling as a tracker and lawman. He was honest about the loneliness of his work, the constant travel, the danger, but he also spoke of the satisfaction of bringing criminals to justice, of making the territory a safer place. Preston learned that Clara had come to New Mexico with her parents when she was 14, part of a small group hoping to start a farming community outside Pinos Altos. The cholera epidemic had killed several families, including Clara's parents, leaving her alone at 16. She had survived by taking in sewing, doing laundry, and helping at the general store. It had been a hard 6 years, but she had carved out a life for herself. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Preston asked on his last evening before departing for Santa Fe. They were sitting on her porch, watching the sunset over the distant mountains. "Sometimes," Clara admitted, "but this is my home now. I know everyone here, and they know me. That counts for something." "It does," Preston agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Clara, I know it has only been a few days, and the circumstances of how we met were unusual, to say the least, but I find myself thinking about you constantly. When I ride out tomorrow, I'm going to be counting the days until I can ride back." Clara turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "I have been thinking about you too," she confessed. "I know it is fast, maybe too fast, but I cannot help it. You saved my life, Preston. You were there when I needed someone most. I do not think I will ever forget that." Preston reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I do not want you to feel obligated to me because of what happened. You do not owe me anything." "This is not about obligation," Clara said firmly. "This is about how I feel when I am with you. Safe, yes, but more than that. Seen, understood, like I matter." "You do matter," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. "You matter very much." They sat holding hands as the sky darkened and stars began to appear, and Clara felt something shifting inside her, something she had kept locked away for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. Hope. The possibility of something more than just survival. Preston left at dawn the next morning, riding out with the 3 outlaws secured in a wagon driven by Sheriff Morrison's deputy. Clara stood on her porch and watched until they disappeared from view, already missing him with an intensity that surprised her. The weeks that followed were the longest of Clara's life. She went about her daily routines, working at the general store, tending her small garden, attending church on Sundays. But her thoughts were constantly with Preston, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he was thinking of her as much as she was thinking of him. She received a letter 3 weeks after he left, delivered by the weekly mail coach. Preston's handwriting was neat and precise, and Clara read the letter so many times she nearly memorized it. He wrote about the journey to Santa Fe, the successful delivery of the prisoners, and his current assignment tracking a gang of cattle thieves near Albuquerque. But most importantly, he wrote about missing her and his intention to return to Pinos Altos as soon as his work allowed. Clara wrote back immediately, telling him about her days, the small happenings in town, and how she found herself looking up every time she heard hoofbeats, hoping it might be him returning. She tried not to sound too desperate or too forward, but she wanted him to know she was waiting. 2 more letters followed over the next month, each one making Clara's feelings grow stronger. Preston wrote about tracking the cattle thieves through rough terrain, about sleeping under the stars and thinking of her. He wrote about wanting to build a different kind of life, one that did not involve constant danger and solitude. He asked if she would mind being involved with a man whose work took him away sometimes, acknowledging it would not be easy. Clara's response was immediate and heartfelt. She told him she understood the demands of his work, that she respected what he did and why he did it. She also told him, with more courage than she knew she possessed, that she believed some things were worth the difficulty, worth the waiting, worth the risk. It was nearly 2 months after Preston had left when Clara was working at the general store, helping Mrs. Henderson select fabric for a new dress, when she heard someone say, "Excuse me, but I am looking for Clara Nash." She turned around and there he was, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand and dust on his clothes from hard riding. Preston Xavier, looking tired and weathered and more wonderful than Clara remembered. "Preston," she breathed, and then she was moving, crossing the store without conscious thought. Propriety be damned, she thought as she walked straight into his arms. He caught her, holding her close, and Clara heard Mrs. Henderson's shocked gasp somewhere behind her, but did not care. "I'm sorry it took so long," Preston murmured into her hair. "The assignment ran longer than expected, but I'm here now." Clara pulled back just enough to look up at him, tears streaming down her face. "You came back." I promised I would, Preston said, smiling down at her. Did you doubt me? No, Clara said honestly, not for a moment. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat loudly, and Clara suddenly remembered where they were. She stepped back, wiping at her tears, but Preston kept one hand on her arm as if he could not bear to completely let her go. Mrs. Henderson, this is Preston Xavier, Clara said, trying to compose herself. He is the man who saved my life. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened immediately. The whole town knew the story by now, embellished with each retelling. Mr. Xavier, she said with approval, we have heard much about you. Welcome back to Pinos Altos. Thank you, madam, Preston said politely, but his eyes never left Clara. Clara turned to Mrs. Henderson. Would you mind if I took the rest of the day? I know it is short notice. Mrs. Henderson made a shooing motion with her hands. Go, go. I can manage the store for one afternoon. You two have much to discuss, I'm sure. Clara grabbed her shawl and walked out with Preston, acutely aware of the eyes watching them through the store window. They walked without speaking until they reached Clara's house, and once inside with the door closed, Preston pulled her into his arms again. I missed you, he said simply. Every day, every mile, I missed you. I missed you too, Clara replied, her face pressed against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady. Your letters kept me going. Your letters kept me sane, Preston said. He pulled back and cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. Clara, I have been thinking about this for 2 months. I know we have not known each other long, and I know my work makes things complicated, but I do not want to waste time pretending I do not feel what I feel. What do you feel? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I am falling in love with you, Preston said. Maybe I have been since the moment I saw you standing in that grave, refusing to let those men break your spirit. You are the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I want to build a life with you, if you will have me. Clara's heart felt like it might burst. I love you too, she said, the words spilling out. I've been trying to tell myself it was too fast, that I barely knew you, but my heart would not listen. I love you, Preston Xavier. Preston's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He leaned down and kissed her, and Clara's world tilted and righted itself all at once. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then deepened as they both gave in to the feelings they had been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara felt dizzy with happiness. Marry me, Preston said, still holding her close. I know it is fast, I know people will talk, but I do not care. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time. Marry me, Clara. Clara laughed, a sound of pure joy. Yes, she said, yes, I will marry you. Preston kissed her again, and then they were both laughing and holding each other, and Clara felt like she was floating. She had gone from facing death in a grave to being held by the man she loved, and the transformation felt miraculous. They spent the rest of that day making plans. Preston explained that he had been saving his earnings for years, living simply and putting money aside. He had enough to buy a small ranch outside of town, somewhere they could build a life together. He would continue doing some work for the marshal's office, but only assignments that did not take him too far from home or keep him away for too long. I want to be here with you, he said firmly. I want to build something that lasts. I have spent 5 years chasing outlaws across the territory. It is time I found something worth staying for. Clara felt tears pricking her eyes again. Are you sure? I do not want you to give up work you find meaningful. I'm not giving it up entirely, Preston assured her, but I am changing my priorities. You are my priority now, Clara. You and the life we are going to build together. They decided to marry quickly, within the month. There was no reason to wait, and both of them felt they had already waited long enough. Clara's friends in town were surprised by the speed of the engagement, but supportive once they heard the whole story. Preston was clearly devoted to Clara, and anyone with eyes could see how she lit up when he was near. The wedding was held in the small church where Clara had worshipped for 6 years. Preston wore a new black suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable, unused as he was to formal clothing. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk that she had sewn herself, working late into the night to have it ready in time. Father Domingo performed the ceremony, his Spanish accent adding music to the familiar words. Clara's hands shook as she repeated her vows, not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. When Preston slipped the simple gold ring onto her finger, she looked up into his green eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Father Domingo said with a warm smile. "You may kiss your bride." Preston needed no further encouragement. He pulled Clara close and kissed her thoroughly, earning cheers and applause from the assembled townspeople. When they finally broke apart, Clara was blushing furiously, but she could not stop smiling. The reception was held at the boarding house with Mrs. Chen providing a feast that seemed far too elaborate for the small mining town. But the community had embraced this love story, this tale of rescue and romance, and everyone wanted to celebrate. Preston and Clara danced, ate, and laughed, surrounded by well-wishers and friends. As the evening drew to a close, Preston and Clara slipped away to the small ranch house Preston had purchased the week before. It was modest but sturdy, with 2 rooms and a fireplace, set on 20 acres of decent grazing land. Preston carried Clara over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in what would be their bedroom. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," he said softly. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck. "I like the sound of that." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them both breathless and amazed. Clara had never been with a man before, and Preston was patient and gentle, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally fell asleep tangled together, Clara felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. The months that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. She and Preston fell into an easy rhythm, working together to make the ranch successful. Preston took on a few tracking assignments, but always local ones that allowed him to return home within a few days. The rest of his time was spent building up their small herd of cattle, repairing fences, and improving the house. Clara continued her sewing work, now taking commissions from people throughout the territory. Her skill with a needle was becoming known, and she enjoyed having work of her own, something that was hers. Preston encouraged her, often sitting with her in the evenings while she sewed, reading aloud from the newspaper or a book. 6 months after their wedding, Clara realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week, hoping, before finally going to see Dr. Murphy in town. The old doctor examined her and confirmed what she suspected. "You're with child, Mrs. Xavier," he said with a smile. "About 2 months along, I would say. Congratulations." Clara walked home in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach. A baby. She and Preston were going to have a baby. By the time she reached the ranch, she was smiling so widely her face hurt. Preston was mending a section of fence when she arrived. He looked up at the sound of her approach, and whatever he saw in her face made him drop his tools and stride toward her. "What is it? What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Everything is right. Preston, we are going to have a baby." Preston's expression went through several rapid changes: shock, wonder, and then pure joy. He let out a whoop that startled the horses in the corral and picked Clara up, spinning her around before carefully setting her back down. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though his reaction had already answered the question. "Happy." Preston cupped her face in his hands. "Clara, I'm more than happy. I'm overwhelmed, amazed, terrified, but mostly just incredibly grateful." They held each other for a long time, standing in the dusty ranch yard, thinking about the future and the family they were creating. That night, lying in bed with Preston's hand resting protectively on her stomach, Clara thought back to that terrible day when she had stood in a grave, certain she was going to die. If someone had told her then that less than a year later she would be here, married to the man who saved her and carrying his child, she never would have believed it. But life, she was learning, had a way of surprising you. The worst days could lead to the best ones, and sometimes salvation came in the form of a cowboy riding out of the setting sun. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Clara dealt with morning sickness for the first few months. Preston was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so, until Clara had to gently remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was not made of glass. "I know," Preston said, looking sheepish, "but you are my wife, and that is my child. I cannot help wanting to protect you both." You do protect us, Clara assured him, but you also need to let me live my life. I am not going to break, Preston. I am stronger than I look. Preston smiled and pulled her close. I know how strong you are. I knew it the moment I saw you. But that does not mean I will stop worrying. As Clara's belly grew, so did their preparations. Preston built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it carefully to ensure there were no rough edges. Clara sewed tiny clothes, marveling at how small they were. Mrs. Henderson and the other women in town provided advice, some helpful and some contradictory, but all given with good intentions. Preston had turned down several tracking assignments as Clara's due date approached, refusing to be away from home when the baby came. His supervisor at the marshal's office was understanding, and Preston's reputation was strong enough that he could afford to be selective about his work. Clara went into labor on a warm spring evening, exactly 9 months after their wedding. The pains started gradually, and she and Preston had time to ride into town to Dr. Murphy's office. The old doctor took one look at Clara and set up his examining room, sending Preston out to the waiting area with strict instructions not to interfere. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Preston wore a path in the doctor's floor with his pacing, jumping every time he heard Clara cry out. "Doctor!" Murphy appeared periodically with updates, assuring Preston that everything was progressing normally, but Preston would not relax until he heard his child's first cry. When it finally came, that thin wail of new life, Preston's legs nearly gave out with relief. Dr. Murphy emerged a few minutes later, smiling broadly. You have a son, Mr. Xavier, a healthy, strong boy, and your wife did wonderfully. She's tired but well. You can come in now. Preston rushed into the room to find Clara propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face and smiled. Come meet your son. Preston approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was waving one miniature fist in the air. As Preston watched, mesmerized, the baby opened his eyes and seemed to look directly at him. He is perfect, Preston whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. You are perfect. Clara, I do not have words. You do not need words, Clara said softly. She shifted the baby slightly. Do you want to hold him? Preston nodded and carefully took his son, supporting the baby's head the way Dr. Murphy had instructed months ago during one of their visits. The weight was almost nothing, but it felt like Preston was holding the entire world in his arms. This tiny person was his responsibility, his to protect and raise and love. What should we name him? Clara asked. They had discussed names for months but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Preston said, What about Michael? Michael Joseph Xavier? Clara smiled. Michael, I like that. Hello, Michael. Welcome to the world. They stayed in town for 3 days while Clara recovered her strength, then carefully made the journey back to the ranch. Preston drove the wagon at a crawl, hyper-aware of every bump and rut in the road. Clara sat beside him holding Michael, amused by her husband's extreme caution, but also touched by it. Life with a newborn was exhausting and exhilarating. Michael was a good baby overall, but he required constant care. Clara was overwhelmed at first, but Preston proved to be a natural father. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Michael when the baby was fussy, and sat up with Clara during the nighttime feedings. I never expected you to be so good at this, Clara said one night as Preston gently rocked Michael back to sleep. Neither did I, Preston admitted, looking down at his son with wonder. But it feels right. He feels right. As Michael grew, so did their family's happiness. The baby was healthy and alert, watching everything with curious dark eyes. Preston reduced his work for the marshal's office even further, taking only the occasional local assignment. The ranch provided enough income for their needs, and Preston found he was content with this quieter life. When Michael was 6 months old, the trial for Dutch Pike and Evans finally took place in Santa Fe. Clara and Preston made the journey together, leaving Michael in the capable care of Mrs. Chen. Clara testified clearly and confidently, and her account, combined with Preston's evidence and the testimony of witnesses from the other robberies, sealed the outlaws' fate. All 3 were sentenced to hang. Clara felt no satisfaction in it, but she felt closure. Those men had tried to take everything from her, and instead they had inadvertently given her everything. If they had not abducted her, Preston would never have ridden into her life. The thought was humbling and strange. On the journey home, Clara voiced this thought to Preston as they camped under the stars. Preston was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've thought about that too. How something terrible led to something wonderful. I do not believe it happened for a reason, not exactly. But I do believe we made the choice to find good in the aftermath of bad. That was us, Clara. We chose this." Clara squeezed his hand. "I would choose it again. Every time." The years passed peacefully. Michael grew into a bright, energetic boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's green eyes. When he was 3, Clara became pregnant again, and this time they welcomed a daughter they named Sarah Margaret. 2 years after that came another daughter, Elizabeth Rose. Preston's work evolved over time. He took on a role training younger trackers for the marshal's office, teaching them the skills he had honed over years in the field. This work allowed him to stay close to home while still serving the territory. He became known as one of the best instructors in the Southwest, and young lawmen competed for the chance to learn from him. Clara's sewing business grew as well. Her work was sought after throughout New Mexico, and she employed 2 young women from town to help her keep up with demand. The extra income allowed them to expand the ranch, adding onto the house and increasing their herd. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston took Clara on a picnic to the spot where he had first seen her, standing in that grave. They had not been back since that terrible day, and Clara had not particularly wanted to go, but Preston thought it was time. "Why are we here?" Clara asked as they stood looking at the depression in the earth, mostly filled in now by wind and rain, but still visible. "Because I want to remember," Preston said. "Not the terror, not the violence, but the moment I knew my life was about to change. I saw you standing here, and I saw your courage. I saw a woman who refused to be broken, and I fell in love with you in that moment, though I did not realize it until later." Clara leaned against him. "I was so frightened." "But you did not show it," Preston said. "You faced death with dignity, and then you faced life with the same courage. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, Clara Xavier." Clara turned to look up at him. "You saved me that day. In every way a person can be saved." "And you saved me right back," Preston replied. "I was so lonely before I met you. I did not even realize how lonely until I found you. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to stop drifting." They kissed there, in the shadow of what had almost been Clara's grave, reclaiming the space with love instead of fear. Then they walked back to where they had left their horses and rode home together toward the life they had built from the ashes of that terrible day. Michael grew into a responsible young man who loved working the ranch with his father. Sarah had her mother's skill with a needle and her father's determination. Elizabeth was the wild one, always getting into mischief and making them laugh. Preston and Clara watched their children grow with pride and amazement, grateful every day for the family they had created. When Preston was 45 and Clara 43, their youngest child, Elizabeth, married a young rancher from Las Cruces. The wedding was held at the ranch, with all of their friends and family gathered to celebrate. As Preston danced with Clara under the stars, he pulled her close and said, "We have done well, have we not?" Clara smiled up at him. "We have done more than well. We have built something beautiful." "Because of you," Preston said. "All of this is because of you." "Because of us," Clara corrected. "We built this together." Preston could not argue with that. Every success, every happy moment, every triumph over hardship had been a joint effort. They were partners in the truest sense, equal in their love and commitment. As the years continued to pass, Preston and Clara grew old together. Their hair turned gray, their bodies moved a bit slower, but their love never diminished. They sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset over the mountains, content in the knowledge that they had lived a good life. Michael took over the main operations of the ranch, having learned everything his father could teach him. He married a smart, kind woman named Anna, and they gave Preston and Clara their first grandchildren. Sarah married a doctor and moved to Albuquerque, but visited often with her growing family. Elizabeth and her rancher husband settled nearby, and she dropped by the ranch almost daily with her children in tow. Preston eventually retired completely, handing over his training duties to a capable former student. He spent his days working in the garden Clara maintained, playing with his grandchildren, and sitting with his wife. He never regretted the choices he had made, the work he had given up, the adventures he had forgone. Everything he needed was right here. On the 50th anniversary of the day, Preston had pulled Clara from that grave. Their children organized a celebration at the ranch. The whole extended family gathered, along with friends from throughout the territory. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears. When it was Preston's turn to speak, he stood with Clara's hand in his and looked around at all the faces watching them. 50 years ago, I was tracking 3 outlaws who had kidnapped a woman from Pinos Altos. I rode out into the desert expecting to do my job, to make an arrest, to see justice done. What I found instead was the love of my life. He looked down at Clara, whose eyes were shining with tears. I found a woman standing in a grave they had made her dig. She was terrified but unbroken, frightened but brave. I pulled her out of that grave, and in doing so, she pulled me out of mine. The grave of loneliness, of purposelessness, of drifting through life without an anchor. Preston's voice grew thick with emotion. Everything good in my life started that day. This family, this home, this love. All of it came from the moment I chose to help a woman in need, and she chose to let me into her heart. I have never regretted a single moment. Clara stood and wrapped her arms around him, and their children and grandchildren applauded. The celebration continued late into the night, but Preston and Clara eventually slipped away to their bedroom, as they had done countless times over the past 50 years. "That was a beautiful speech," Clara said as they prepared for bed. "I meant every word," Preston replied, pulling her close. Even after 50 years, he still felt a thrill at holding her. "I love you, Clara Xavier. I have loved you since the moment I saw you, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Clara said, resting her head against his chest. "Thank you for saving me." "Thank you for letting me," Preston replied. They climbed into bed, and Clara settled into the curve of Preston's body, the same position they had slept in for 5 decades. Outside, the New Mexico wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, and the stars shone bright over the ranch. Inside, 2 people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances drifted off to sleep, their hearts beating in sync. Preston Xavier lived to be 78 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him. She grieved him deeply but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the legacy they had built together. Clara lived another 5 years, long enough to meet her first great-grandchild, a boy named Preston, in honor of the grandfather he would never know. When Clara finally passed at 83, she was buried next to Preston in the small cemetery outside Pinos Altos. Their graves were marked with simple headstones bearing their names and dates, but also an inscription chosen by their children. It read simply, "He saved her, and she saved him right back." The story of Preston and Clara Xavier became legend in New Mexico. People told it to their children and grandchildren, this tale of the cowboy who rescued a woman from her grave and found love in the process. Some details were embellished over time, but the heart of the story remained true. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child, a testament to what Preston and Clara had built. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the mountains in shades of orange and gold, those who lived there swore they could feel the presence of 2 people who had loved each other deeply, completely, and forever. From the darkness of a grave dug in the desert had come light and life and love. From a moment of pure terror had come 5 decades of joy. Preston Xavier had pulled Clara Nash from certain death, and in doing so had found his own salvation. They had built a life together filled with children and laughter, and hard work and triumph. They had grown old together, their love deepening with each passing year. In the end, that is what matters. Not how we start, but what we build. Not the darkness we face, but the light we create. Preston and Clara Xavier had faced death and chosen life. They had faced loneliness and chosen love. They had faced uncertainty and chosen faith. And they had lived happily ever after, in the truest and most complete sense of those words. Their love story began in a grave in the Wild West, but it ended in a home filled with generations of family, all of them carrying forward the legacy of courage, devotion, and love that Preston and Clara had created. The sun set over the New Mexico desert, just as it had 50 years ago when a cowboy rode out to face 3 outlaws and found something he had not known he was searching for. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the echoes of a love story that would never be forgotten. And somewhere, in the space between memory and legend, Preston and Clara Xavier held hands and smiled, knowing their story had reached the ending they had always deserved.